Check it out, Startup Nation. I know many of you are trying to improve your marketing performance, right? You have your business or your e-commerce store and you're trying to increase that brand awareness. No worries, I got you. You should listen to the brand new Keep Optimizing podcast. That's optimizing with an S and not a Z. It's a marketing podcast that will provide you with not only the latest tips and advice in the game, but also you will hear from experts in their field when it comes to email marketing, SEO, and more. This is a must-listen-to podcast for my e-commerce entrepreneurs. It's hosted by Chloe Thomas, who is a 15-year marketing expert, best-selling author, and award-winning podcast host. It's already a top 20 marketing podcast in 7 countries. So clearly, you're going to get amazing value every episode. So as you can see, Startup Nation, you're in good hands with my girl CT. So listen and subscribe to the Keep Optimizing podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere you like to get your favorite podcast. You can also get more information at keepoptimizing.com. The link is there in the show notes.
It's time to be about that life, the startup life. Here's your host, Dominic Lawson.
All right, Startup Nation, so I hope you're ready to receive some value today. My name is Dominic Lawson, and this is The Startup Life, the show for entrepreneurs and career-minded professionals. You know, Startup Nation, we are always trying to predict what happens next, and so that way, we can get ahead of it, right? And we do this in business, we do this in life, we do this in all sorts of ways. But what if I told you that maybe that's not the best way to go about it, and maybe we've fallen victim to prediction addiction? Well, today's guest is here to explain what that is and more. She is a Texas-born, Cambridge-educated author, former media CEO, and award-winning journalist and BBC documentary maker whose TED Talks have been viewed more than 12 million times. Her 6 previous books include Willful Blindness, which is named one of the most important business books of the decade by the Financial Times. She has appeared on NPR, CNN, CNBC, and the BBC, and has written for Fast Company and the Huffington Post. Her latest book is Uncharted: How to Navigate the Future. She is Margaret Heffernan. Margaret, how are you, ma'am?
I am just great, and it's really nice to be talking to you.
Sounds great. We definitely could use your help today. Are you ready to pour some knowledge in the Startup Nation today? Because we're definitely looking to kind of dive into your book and everything else.
Sure, I'm ready for you.
Let's do it. So if you would, just kind of share your origin story and your background a little bit, Margaret, if you don't mind.
Sure. My dad worked in the oil business, so we left Texas and moved to the Netherlands when the North Sea oil was opening up. Mm-hmm. And then we moved to the other side of the North Sea and moved to England. And by then I'd been out of America for longer than I'd been in it. So I decided to stay and go to university. And then I worked for the BBC for 13 years, making radio and TV shows. And then my husband got a position at Harvard. He does medical research.
Gotcha.
And so we moved to Boston. Okay. And I ran tech companies there for nearly 10 years. And then we decided to come back because our families are both here. And I wanted to have some kind of business that had no employees. And it turned out that pretty much limits your choices. So I started writing, and I've been writing and doing speaking engagements and teaching ever since.
Talk about the differences between, living in the States and living in England. What are some of those big differences?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. I thought working in the States was the greatest place I'd ever worked. Okay. I loved the optimism of people. I loved when I said, I'm thinking of starting a business, and, I think I might do this, and so on. Almost every single time people said, that's so fantastic. What can I do to help?
Gotcha.
It was so encouraging. And in the UK, if I said that, people would look at you and think, I see. She can't get a real job.
Wow. That's
so I really, really loved it. And, people were incredibly good to me. They were so supportive. They were so encouraging. They were so helpful. And I just loved it. It was just the best work environment I've really ever known. And I think that quality of optimism and helpfulness that, generally speaking, Americans have is just a phenomenal asset.
I hear that. We definitely often rank highly in the world when it comes to confidence and stuff like that. So I definitely understand that. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your dad. Tell me about your dad a little bit more. You said he worked in the oil business?
Well, my dad's kind of an interesting story. So he came from a desperately poor background of coal miners in Texas.
Okay.
Who kicked him out when he said he wanted to go to college. And so he spent a year working, trying to earn, enough money for a year's tuition, and was kind of saved by the Second World War.
Gotcha.
And so he joined the Navy, and then of course the GI Bill meant that he could go to college, and he trained as an engineer. And he worked for what became Exxon all of his life until he was 55, at which point, because he was quite a difficult individual, if I'm going to be honest.
Gotcha.
They fired him, and he was heartbroken. And I think spent about a year being very depressed. And then he became an entrepreneur, and he set up helping and advising the kind of young, independent energy companies. And he had more fun, and he made more money than the rest of his career put together. And it's so interesting because, of course, in his generation, that is what you did. You got a job with a big corporation. You stayed there for life. And I'm just so grateful that he got a chance to be an entrepreneur because he was absolutely made for it.
Gotcha.
And I've never seen him happier. And he was still working the day he died, just for the love of it.
For sure. For sure. No, I definitely understand that. And that's one of the things we see about very successful, very amazing entrepreneurs. There's never this idea of I'm done. There's never this idea I've made it. I'm successful now. It's like there's just always just love what they do a lot of times, and they just keep doing it until
that's right.
Yeah, so and I always admire that, and I appreciate you sharing that. And it seems like and we're definitely going to dive into your book a little bit just now, but kind of talk about, because your dad kind of lived that uncharted life and just kind of forged ahead. Kind of talk about maybe some of those lessons that we can learn today a little bit from him.
Well, it's interesting because, he was an entrepreneur. My mother was an entrepreneur.
Okay.
So, one of the things I learned from him, kind of the wrong way around.
Right.
Is, it really pays to be nice to people.
Sure.
People like you a lot more if you're not a bully, and he absolutely was a bully. So I think, and I saw the way, when I was growing up, I saw the way that a really kind of heavy corporate culture really kind of shriveled his soul. And I think it's one of the things that made him, so hard and such a bully. And it was quite interesting when he became an entrepreneur that he was so supportive of the young, people starting their oil companies.
Right.
And so, really, he became a very, very much nicer person, I have to say.
Right.
And my mother, got married at the age of 18 and had two kids. And then when I'm the younger one, and by the time I was a teenager, she saw that, that she actually, what she noticed in London was that there were a lot of really beautiful buildings full of really beautiful apartments that were desperately old-fashioned and dusty and faded. And so she started taking them over and modernizing them, and, made another fortune herself doing that. So, and she gradually, through night courses and stuff, graduated from college. But, neither of them were trained for what they ended up doing. And, I'm really interested that most of the people I know who've had really successful careers, none of them started doing what eventually they ended up doing that they were most successful at.
Right.
And I think that, a lot of careers are just a series of experiments. I'm going to try this, and now I know a little bit more about myself. I'm going to try something else. And you kind of, by experiment to experiment, you figure out what you love. But I also think that, approaching work that way is useful because the world keeps changing.
Absolutely.
So my dad couldn't have been an entrepreneur when he graduated from college, but he could later in life. And you keep changing.
Right.
So I loved working for the BBC for 13 years, but then I just had a kind of independent streak that they couldn't satisfy.
For sure.
So, so I left not because I was unhappy there, but because there were just other experiments I wanted to try.
For sure. For sure. Thank you for sharing that. And speaking of experiments, that leads me back to your book that we're going to dive into, Uncharted, Startup Nation, how to navigate the future. And if you ready to purchase that book, we have a link there in the show notes for easy access if you're listening to the replay on the podcast, for sure. And so speaking of experiments, you talk about that in your book quite a lot. You talked about it in the book, you talk about it in TED Talk, but kind of talk about the importance of, experimenting and being okay to, to fail with those experiments and what you learn.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I generally, don't talk about the failure of experiments because experiments in science are really designed to learn the next thing.
Right.
So even experiments that don't prove their hypotheses, they tell you something, namely your hypothesis was wrong.
Right.
So you still now know something that you didn't know before. And so I think it's much more helpful to people to say, experiments are just how we learn. I think they're how the human race has always learned. It's how we've progressed is by trying stuff, learning from it, and starting, and then going on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. So, and it's interesting because I was talking to a bunch of undergraduates who were just starting college this week, and one of them asked me about failure. And I said, just don't think of it that way because you'll beat yourself up and you'll lose confidence.
I hear that.
If you think of doing experiments, then the really important thing is regardless of what happened in the experiment, what have you learned? What have you learned about yourself? What have you learned about the thing you were experimenting in? And, the people who learn fastest, make greatest progress.
For sure. For sure. Thank you for sharing that. Now, Margaret, I understand that part about, thinking about experiments and thinking about thinking about failure in a different place, thinking about it differently. Sorry. But it's almost kind of like we've been ingrained, whether it be through school, whether it be through society, like if you're not right, you're wrong. And so how do you, like, as a leader in an organization, how do you help change that mindset within the culture to think of experimenting differently?
Yeah. Well, I think the really important thing in any kind of organization is when you start doing something that's never been done before, which is what innovation is.
Right.
That I think it really helps to use the language of experimentation.
Gotcha.
Because, as opposed to, say, a pilot, because then you kind of move away from the language of failure. And, that doesn't mean that when I was running tech companies, I was just, all laid back and, let's just see what we learn and never mind what happens.
Right.
But I think, so you want people to be pretty sharp and focused about what they're doing. But, almost everybody in tech knows that the first time you build something is not going to be perfect.
Of course.
So I think, the point is, how good can we get it this time? And then when it's done, what have we learned that can make it better? So I think this whole idea of we're on a path that leads to better is I think it leads to more creative thinking.
Gotcha.
And I think, I write about this in my book, which is, one of the things that has made 3M so brilliant in its innovation is they do lots of experiments and lots and lots and lots of them don't work. But what they don't do is bury them 6 feet deep and pretend they never happened.
Right.
And so they do these very detailed postmortems, and they ask this really great question, which is, what would have to change for this really to be a winner? And the reason they ask that is because a lot of the things that they're working on, the only reason they don't work is because the market's not there yet.
Gotcha.
So what they're doing is saying, let's keep an eye on this market. Let's make sure when it starts to grow that we get this out of the cupboard and look at it again. And people always say, how does 3M manage to innovate so fast? Well, it isn't fast. It's just that they don't forget what they learned before, and they look for the moment that's right for it.
For sure. For sure. Thank you for sharing that. Also in the book, you have a chapter, and this chapter, Startup Nation, is Does History Repeat Itself? And you talk about this story about Robert McNamara and the Vietnam War. Kind of share that story and some bullet points from that story, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, so lots of people think history repeats itself,
Right.
and historians know that it doesn't, right?
Right.
And one of the things people always say when they talk about this is Munich. Every time there's a terrible dictator who has to be confronted, it's like Munich. It's when we should have confronted Hitler.
Right.
And when America went into the Vietnam War, both Eisenhower and Johnson kept comparing Munich to Vietnam. And McNamara later in life said, this is just a completely ridiculous comparison, because nothing about Vietnam, not its politics, not its culture, not its history, none of it is like Munich.
Right.
Nothing about China. So one of the big fears was, that if Vietnam went communist, then, China would try to take it over. The Vietnamese had all through their history had an absolute fear and hatred of China. The notion of kind of becoming part of China was never going to happen. I mean, they would rather become American than become Chinese.
Right.
And he said, the problem with thinking this is like Munich, this is like a European culture, McNamara said, meant that we didn't think about anything else. And we didn't do our research, and we didn't talk to the right people, and we didn't understand the culture. And so we just made mistake after mistake after mistake, because we thought we knew where we were. The metaphor of Munich gave us a level of comfort that was completely misleading.
Right. Yeah, it's funny you mention that, because, and you talk about how, those analogies can be very dangerous. It's almost like when we come across thing that's, like a crisis or something like that, we're so quick to attach it to something we already know. Is that because we're trying to look for our own type of comfort? We're trying to hurry up and solve the problem. Where do you think that comes from?
Well, it's probably, our brains are very well designed to recognize patterns.
Right.
Because, then it's because if you think if it's a real pattern, it's a fantastic shortcut.
Right.
So it's partly that. So we tend to overemphasize the similarities, and then we trivialize and marginalize the differences. But the differences is where all the helpfulness of history lies. Why is it different this time? And what, historians said to me is the reason history doesn't repeat itself is because the history. So you have knowledge that people in that historical moment did not have. So what you should think about is, what do we know beyond the history that can help us make different, better, and more relevant decisions?
For sure.
And there's a great example of that in my book, talking about a really wonderful Irish historian who started writing about Irish history in a very different way from the kind of cliche of, the Irish people doomed to be in bondage to the British forever. And, many people in Ireland today say that the rewriting or reinterpretation of Irish history is a kind of change people's sense of themselves and what the country was capable of. And that thinking about their history in a different way made it possible for the Good Friday peace agreement to be signed. And, so it's a really powerful illustration how if we think of history as something that's susceptible to change, we can see opportunities. Whereas if we think history repeats itself, we see nothing except blockage. Or we feel unduly confident when, in fact, we're out of our depth.
For sure. For sure. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. I wanted to ask you about something else in the book. You have a chapter, Think Like an Artist, and you have in here a quote, we talk about starting, quote, artists begin without being asked, end quote. And so I know a lot of times in business, or even in education, when it comes to students, it's like we'll say, create a story involving, I don't know, lions. And they'll be like, so how you want me to do it? How you want me to add, how you want me to frame it? And it's like, instead of just doing it, so why is that important, for, to kind of implement that in kind of business mindset or whatever the case may be in a business or a culture or organization is what I'm saying actually.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I often think that entrepreneurs and artists have quite a lot in common because they both are fantastic at picking up what I think of as early signals, just getting a sense of something new is possible or now something new is wanted. And they're very often, as we know, ahead of their time. And they don't wait for validation because if, by the time you've got all the validation you need, it's too late. Right. Other people are there before you. And what artists do is they kind of follow their instincts. They're much less data-driven, and they're much less interested in kind of pleasing an existing market.
Right.
And one reason I wrote about artists was because I think that, what's so fascinating is that they have, of course, written books, poems, plays, created paintings, all sorts of things, which are way, way ahead of their time and which have incredible staying power. And they don't do that because they've done the market research to figure out what people want. They do it because they're supremely in tune with their times. And I think the best of entrepreneurs are like that too. They're really, really sensitive to social changes, to mood changes, to technological changes. And, the very best of them invent things way before anybody's saying they want them. I mean, the personal computer is, of course, a perfect example.
Right.
Nobody in the world was saying we want one of these, but it didn't stop people from making them. And, of course, the people who waited until there was a demand, by the time it was obvious, it was too late.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. We a lot of times, sorry about that. A lot of times we do have some people who just kind of wait for that demand. And by that time, you're just, it's too late. The market's already left you, or at the very least, you kind of, don't, at the very least, don't get the desired result you wanted, if you hadn't started from the beginning. So I appreciate you, sharing all of that for sure. Startup Nation, once again, we're talking to Margaret Heffernan, the author of Uncharted, How to Navigate the Future. I wanted to ask you this because in your book, you have a lot of great stories, in the book that kind of reemphasize some of your points and stuff like that. And I know you actually kind of wrote this book right before the crisis, our global pandemic, has kind of reared its ugly head. Kind of talk about, not necessarily that, you saw this coming or whatever, but kind of talk about the reception that you've been receiving when people say, wow, this book is very timely.
Yes. Well, it is, of course, incredibly timely. I mean, we launched it in London a month before lockdown. And of course, it's just come out in the U.S. There's a lot about epidemics, and absolutely not because I picked this one, because I absolutely did not, but because epidemics are a fantastic, kind of perfect illustration of uncertainty. And people talk about uncertainty a great deal, but I think without quite understanding either what it really is or what it feels like. And so the thing that's so interesting about epidemics is that they're generally certain. They are always happening.
Right.
Throughout, forever through human history. But every single one is different. There's no profile of an epidemic. And as a consequence, you don't know when they're going to start. You don't know where they're going to start. And you don't know what the disease is going to be each time. So they are absolutely unpredictable. So you're in this really uncomfortable position, which uncertainty is, where you know something's going to happen, but you don't have enough information to plan for it. And so, a lot of my book looks at, okay, but just because you don't have all the information you need should not stop you from preparing. And in the last chapter, I wrote about this amazing organization called the Center for Epidemic Preparedness, which, in 2017 started work on coronavirus vaccines, started work on if we ever needed a massive amount of them, who would we get to manufacture them? Started work on connecting members and parts of the healthcare community that could work together quickly in the case of a pandemic. And, the only thing they did wrong is, we'd all wish they'd started 10 years earlier.
Right.
But they started doing all of that because they noticed that government had stopped doing all of this. They used to do it, but they'd stopped doing it because we'd had so many years without an epidemic. They thought, why waste the money? It's never going to happen. Who cares?
Right.
And, it's a classic failure on the part of government to understand that it's in the very nature of uncertainty that these things are unpredictable. And therefore, you have to do what they call just-in-case planning, because the failure to plan is so costly that even if you do lots of preparation that you never use, it's still better because the failure to do it is so much worse.
Right. Right. Do you think that also just comes from like you said, it will never happen again. We have other pressing matters and stuff like that. And so you just, it's just always fascinating because I remember reading an article here in the States about George W. Bush, and he read the book about the Spanish flu, and he was telling people that we need to get ahead of this and stuff like that. So it almost seems like, you have some of these people who say like, we have to prepare for it. Then it's like, we'll be fine. You know what I mean? Which can be just ultimately dangerous. So I appreciate you sharing all that. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
So I think, part of what happened also is that at one point, in 2019, actually, there was a sort of simulation of, in the case of a pandemic in America, what would we do? And they ran this simulation over several days, and they discovered all kinds of things that didn't work, and different agencies that didn't communicate with each other, and things that were in short supply, and all that kind of thing. So they actually discovered many of the things that we've had to live, in real time. But then they didn't follow up and do anything about it.
Right.
So they actually had the information, but absolutely to your point, I think there were other things to do. But I also think that, we've grown up in an age where a lot used to be predictable. And therefore, we've grown up really obsessed with efficiency.
Right.
And everything, we don't want any waste because that's inefficient. And the problem is that where you have things that are uncertain, you can't afford to be 100% efficient because then you don't have the resources you need when you need them. And so I think what happened is, the Trump administration kind of was enthralled to the idea of let's not waste anything. And so all this learning which they had, they did not act upon. And the consequence, of course, has been beyond tragic.
Right. And I'm glad you said that. Startup Nation, and speaking of efficiency, Startup Nation, if you look in the link in the show notes, we also have a link for Margaret's TED Talk, and she talks about the efficiency myth and stuff like that, in that TED Talk, which I thought was really fascinating. You actually talked about this story about nurses in a hospital. Could you share a little bit about that, if you would?
So, one of the things that we found here in the UK, for example, is that we've worked very hard in our National Health Service to keep everything super, super, super efficient.
Right.
And the consequence of that was, it's just like just in time. We didn't have enough protective equipment. We didn't have enough ventilators. We didn't actually even have enough nurses, as it turned out. And, so this is, and of course, the thing is that for a government, it looks fantastic if you say our critical care unit is being used, it has to 99% capacity. Because it says, well, that's great planning, right? You don't have any waste.
Right.
But of course, when you have, actually, even if we'd had a terrible, plane crash or car crash, it would have been overextended. So, I think it's really interesting because almost all businesses obsess over efficiency.
Right.
And in the transitions that we've all had to make to working from home, of course, suddenly they discovered, yikes, lots of the people who work for us, don't have good Wi-Fi, or they don't have a decent office chair, or they don't have laptops.
Right.
And, the amount of scurrying around that had to happen, was well and truly terrible, really, for a lot of people. So I think there's a real lesson here, which is we have to learn to discover, to define the difference between things that are predictable and things that are not. And the way that I talk about this in the book is it's the difference between things that are complicated, where we have a lot of control over it, and where things do repeat themselves very predictably.
Right.
And things that are complex, where there are so many forces influencing so many forces, some of them that we can see and some of them that we can't. And situations where very small things can make such a huge difference. In these things, although there are patterns, they're not predictable. And that's where we need more robustness. And, a classic example of that is, if you had been running a company whose sole business was the manufacturing of plastic straws,
right,
you would have had a terrible year last year. If, on the other hand, plastic straws was just one of your products, and you also made paper straws, and you also made all kinds of other things, you probably would have been okay.
Right.
And I think, we need to start, we've become so obsessed with specialization and really fine margins and so on. And we've become, I think, a little overconfident that we have everything in control. And, globalization has made it very, very much harder to have everything under control, because you just need a severe weather event somewhere, or labor disturbances, or trade disputes, or political upheaval to discover that your suppliers cannot get their goods to you.
Right.
And this again happened in the pandemic, where lots of parts that had to come from China, could not come from China because China was using them all.
Right.
So I think we have to do a very big rethink about how much we remain slaves to efficiency, because it has hidden dangers that we can fall into at great cost.
Right. And you talk about that a lot in your book, in your writings, in your speaking engagements, about that human element kind of being interwoven into that efficiency myth, and how we are so data driven. We are so data driven about certain things that we forget about the human element. You did a fantastic way of illustrating this in your TED Talk, when you talk about the grocery store and the kids with trying to buy up all the coconuts or something like that, which I thought was very interesting for sure. Once again, Startup Nation. Go ahead.
This is kind of interesting because it was a supermarket. Supermarkets have to do thousands of checks every day,
right,
to make sure that food is safe. And they started thinking, well, instead of all these teams we have, why don't we just computerize all this,
right,
and allocate tasks to everybody? And then we don't need any managers, and we don't need any teams and all this malarkey.
Right.
And so they did that, thinking this is a relatively controllable, complicated business. But what they'd forgotten was customers. And it may be that your refrigerators are really predictable, and your SKUs are really predictable, but customers, it turns out, are not.
Right.
So you get a kid come in who knocks over a display. Well, the computer allocating jobs doesn't know about that. And you have the local high school say, well, tomorrow everybody has to bring in a coconut. Mm-hmm. The computer doesn't talk to the high school, right?
Right.
And so suddenly, they realize that, wow, there's all this stuff that happens that's unpredictable. And now we fired all our managers. We don't have anybody who knows how to run this stuff anymore. Right. And, then the other story, which I think you were mentioning earlier about the nurses,
right?
Is a fantastic experiment. I love experiments.
Of
you
course.
can probably tell.
I can tell.
Where a lot of healthcare in the Netherlands is done at home, because it's very well understood. People recover much faster at home when they come out of the hospital. And so there was this very, very complicated bureaucratic system where you come out and your insurance allocates a contract to a nursing company, and the nurse gets told, go and visit this patient for 5 minutes on Wednesday and 3 minutes on Thursday and 7 minutes on Friday, and, barcode everything. And all the nurses hated it because it made them feel like robots.
Right.
And a nurse who also had a background in economics said, well, let's just try something different here. So let's automate the allocation of contracts, because that is the same every time, totally predictable.
Right.
But then let's not try to predict how much and what kind of nursing each patient gets, because every patient is different.
Exactly.
So instead of trying to manage this so minutely, let's just tell the nurses, do what you think is right. Use your judgment. And I mean, this is an amazing experiment because they didn't know what would happen. They just thought, well, maybe it'll make the nurses happier, right?
Right.
But what they found was that the cost of providing the whole service fell by 30% because the patients got better in half the time. Because the nurses could make that day-by-day judgment. You know, Mrs. Jones needs a lot of attention today or no attention today, or she needs to do more exercise or less exercise. So they were getting really personalized attention, and they recovered very much faster. And I think, you know, what I love about this story is that the nurse who kicked it off said, you know, you couldn't think your way to this incredible saving.
Right.
You couldn't model it on a spreadsheet. There is no other way to find this out except to try it. And when I said to him, you know, was there anything that really surprised you? He said, I just had no idea it could be so easy to make such a gigantic improvement. And it's kind of interesting now because I'm actually working with a kind of new healthcare system in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And they've been set up specifically to try to do healthcare in a different way. And, you know, getting them to do experiments is like pulling teeth.
I believe
because although they have been set up specifically to try to reinvent healthcare so it's better, it's more successful, it's less expensive, and it's more patient-centric. You know, the kind of gravitational pull of convention and tradition is enormous. And I keep saying to them, if you don't try something different, you're never going to get a different outcome.
For sure.
But, you know, they're so afraid of, you know, failure, as we were discussing earlier,
right,
that, you know, they're just terrified. But the whole reason that they exist is to try to find something better. Because everybody knows, you know, healthcare in America is too expensive, it's too slow, it's too bureaucratic. And, you know, after 3 years, 50% of doctors wish they weren't in medicine anymore. So this is a real problem. And you're not going to solve it by thinking about it. You have to try different ways of solving medical problems.
All right, Startup Nation, so we're going to go ahead and take a quick break. We got to pay some bills. Once again, my name is Dominic Lawson, and you're listening to The Startup Life. Check it out, Startup Nation. I know many of you are trying to improve your marketing performance, right? You have your business or your e-commerce store and you're trying to increase that brand awareness. No worries, I got you. You should listen to the brand new Keep Optimizing podcast. That's optimizing with an S and not a Z. It's a marketing podcast that will provide you with not only the latest tips and advice in the game, but also you will hear from experts in their field when it comes to email marketing, SEO, and more. This is a must-listen-to podcast for my e-commerce entrepreneurs. It's hosted by Chloe Thomas, who is a 15-year marketing expert, best-selling author, and award-winning podcast host. It's already a top 20 marketing podcast in 7 countries, so clearly you're going to get amazing value every episode. So as you can see, Startup Nation, you're in good hands with my girl CT. So listen and subscribe to the Keep Optimizing podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere you like to get your favorite podcast. You can also get more information at keepoptimizing.com. The link is there in the show notes. Oralex powers this episode of The Startup Life. Startup Nation, as a podcaster, radio host, and business owner, I know a thing or two about the need for your message to come through clearly to your target audience. The last thing you want when trying to close a big deal over the phone or giving a sales presentation in your conference room is to have the person you are talking to be distracted by either the fact that you sound like you're in a warehouse or an outside noise like a fire truck. Trust me, Startup Nation, I know this all too well from experience. And that is why Oralex has your back. Oralex Acoustics creates professionally tested products that you can trust in a commercial space or at home. Better office acoustics improves intelligibility when video conferencing or generic conversation, reduces stress, and helps build a proactive work atmosphere. From a home studio for my content creators to your office space downtown, your gear performs better in an acoustically treated room. Trust me, you are in good hands with Oralex, as they are the #1 brand in acoustics, providing trusted solutions for over 40 years. Also, you can download the Oralex Acoustic Treatment mobile app in the Apple or Google Play Store to give you specifically designed and instantaneous recommendations for various room types. Go to Oralex.com and use the promo code STARTUP in all caps for 10% off your entire order. The link is there in the show notes if you are listening to the replay on the podcast. So if you are ready to stop sounding like you're having a sales meeting in a sports arena, go with Oralex. Professional audio made simple. Tresta powers this episode of The Startup Life. Okay, Startup Nation, I want to talk to you about our sponsor, Tresta. Tresta is an app for iPhone and Android that lets you do business calling and texting from anywhere. I know so many entrepreneurs that are still using their personal phone number for business calls. It can get complicated drawing the line between your personal and professional life. Startup Nation, this is the best business phone app out there. Whether you just need a business phone number or if your team is ready for a complete business phone system, Tresta is totally flexible and can grow with your business. And it's all unlimited calling, texting, and all of the powerful call management features like auto attendance, call recording, user groups, and more for just $15 per user per month. With Tresta, there's no contract, and you don't need any special hardware, just your smartphone you're already using. Tresta is easy to configure, so you can set everything up yourself, all online, avoiding all the hassle and high overhead costs of setting up a traditional business phone system, which is important because as entrepreneurs, we are always trying to cut cost and time. They're offering a 30-day free trial so you can see if Tresta's virtual phone system is right for you. Communicate smarter and more efficiently with Tresta. Start now at Tresta.com/startuplife. That's TRESTA.com/startuplife. The link is there in the show notes if you're listening on the podcast. Tresta, business communication simplified. All right, Startup Nation, welcome back as we continue our conversation with today's guest here on The Startup Life. For sure. And I appreciate you sharing that because I find, what you're saying about healthcare, there's a lot of parallels when it comes to education as well. Mm-hmm. When I think of nurses, I think of teachers. When I think of patients, I think of students. And I think, one of the two biggest things that are ripe for disruption, but are probably resistant to it the most seems to me, in my opinion, is healthcare and education. So I can definitely understand and I appreciate you sharing all of that for sure. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I think it's a great insight because actually the nurse who did this phenomenal work in the Netherlands is now starting to work with local schools because he saw exactly what you've seen.
Right.
And it'll be fascinating to see what happens. I'll keep you posted.
Please do. Definitely. We're an education consulting firm at our core. And so we're definitely always looking for innovations and ways to improve education. So I appreciate you sharing that, Margaret, for sure. Startup Nation, we're actually wrapping up with Margaret Heffernan, the author of Uncharted, How to Navigate the Future. We have a link there in the show notes for easy access if you're listening to the replay on the podcast, but also check out mheffernan.com. We have that link there as well, where you can check out Margaret and all of her books and all her resources that she has on her website. Margaret, I want to ask you something really quickly. Because, you spent, a good amount of time at the BBC, and the BBC is a news organization that I highly respect here across the pond. I want to ask you your kind of commentary or your or on the state of journalism right now. It seems like maybe we're in a place where we're kind of in the era of like what people call quote unquote fake news or whatever. And we have a lot of people who are so quick to be first as opposed to being right. So I guess I'm just curious about your your commentary on the state of journalism as we are right now.
Yeah. Well, I think the state of journalism is a kind of classic market failure.
Okay.
That as journalism became a purely commercial market,
right,
it has hugely fed an appetite for sensationalism and, let's face it, fiction.
Right.
And I mean, I think, to be honest, I think it's worse in the US than it is in the UK, but I think it's a problem absolutely everywhere.
Gotcha.
And I think the great thing about the BBC, which is, I think still a truly great institution and one of the greatest reputation builders
absolutely
for the United Kingdom that we have, is there is still just this incredible dedication to get it right, to be fair, to cover all the bases. And of course, nobody always gets it right.
Of course.
But I think they have a fundamental remit that they take really seriously, which is to cover all sorts of stories, regardless of, whether they're just going to win the ratings that day.
Right.
And I think if we're going to get journalism back into some kind of better place, I think there has to be more room made for nonprofit journalism. I think there just has to be.
Gotcha.
And I think, I did some work many years ago with the FCC, and I think it didn't see the market failure that was staring it in the face. I know firsthand, it did not see the impact that the internet would have. The absolute disappearance of local newspapers, for example, in the United States.
Right.
And I don't know how we get back to a better, more wholesome market, but I think it is an absolute abject market failure.
For sure.
And it serves democracy so poorly. You can't have a vibrant democracy if people aren't well informed with trustworthy information.
Right.
And, boy, are we weeping the whirlwind now.
Right. Of course. Do you think, you talked about the internet, a large part of the news that a lot of people get, it comes from social media. Do you think they kind of fed that beast of that failure a little bit? Definitely.
I mean, it's a really interesting question.
Right.
Was the internet a really great idea or not?
And
I have to say, having made my career in it, there are definitely days where I honestly say to myself, I wish we'd never done this.
Gotcha.
It's so out of control.
Right.
And it's so destructive. And, of course, there are other days I think, oh my God, isn't it so fantastic? I can do all this research just sitting at my desk. This is wonderful.
Right.
So, and it's both of those things. But I have to say, and I know lots of people will scream hearing this, but I think it absolutely has got to be regulated because it has shown itself incapable of being responsible.
Right.
And the consequences are just too enormous.
For sure.
And I'm not a big favor of regulation.
Gotcha.
But, certainly what it's doing to democracy all over the world is, for me, unbelievably frightening.
Absolutely. No, I definitely share that sentiment for sure, from the being frightened part and the regulations. But I wanted to get your take on it because I know you have a different vantage point, working at the BBC and stuff like that. That's why a lot of times when I see certain news items and stuff like that, I'll either check the BBC or the Washington Post to see if there's if there's any credibility to what people kind of put out there for sure. So Margaret, I'm actually going to start wrapping up with you. I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you for sharing your book. And once again, Startup Nation, that book is Uncharted, How to Navigate the Future. That link is in the show notes for easy access for you to purchase that book. But I'm actually going to turn the microphone over to you, Margaret, because we have entrepreneurs and business leaders out there who, especially given everything that's going on, feeling a little discouraged, feeling a little down. Could you give us some words of encouragement to take us out for today?
Sure, Dominic, I'd be delighted to. Sure. I think one of the most interesting things about the entrepreneurial life is that there's a deep, rich history of companies that were born in downturns. Dell and Microsoft to name but two, and another one that I've written about extensively, which is Method Home Care products. And one reason that they're often very successful is because in a downturn, there are lots of brilliant people and lots of brilliant suppliers and partners who don't have a full book of work. And so if a startup gets in touch and asks, would you do something for me? In boom times, they wouldn't even answer the email. But in downtimes, they're often willing to just take a chance and work with some new people. And this is absolutely how Method got its start. So they had a business that absolutely depended on having really beautiful packaging. They wrote to some of the top industrial designers in the world saying, could you help us? And they said yes. And because they had these beautiful looking products, they were able, I think in their second or third year, to get into Target, which is absolutely unheard of, for a startup.
Right.
And within a couple more years, in some categories, this little startup was beating Procter & Gamble. Now, they will tell you that, much of what they did in those early years, in the middle of a recession, they would never have been able to do in a booming economy. So take heart and be braver than you would be in a booming economy. The companies you've always wanted to work with, they might be up for it. You don't know if you don't try.
You don't know if you don't try. Thank you so much. And that's going to wrap up our time with Margaret Heffernan. Margaret, thank you so much for coming on the show. We really appreciate your insight.
Well, thank you for a wonderful conversation, Dominic. It's been a real pleasure talking with you.
Sounds good. And as always, Startup Nation, if you have an idea, be about that life, the startup life. If you want to let us know what you think about our show, have an idea for a show topic, or would like to advertise on our show, send us a message on the Startup Life Podcast Facebook page. And while you are there, like and follow our page as well. It's a great way for us to engage with you, Startup Nation, and really grow our community. The link is there in the show notes. Subscribe to the show as it can be heard on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or even on your Facebook timeline or any other platform you like to get your podcast. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts and you find our content valuable, please give us a 5-star rating, as it will help us climb the charts and help more people find our show. You can also listen to the show on the Startup Life Podcast new website. There you will find the all-new startup blog where I write on many topics that are interesting and helpful to you on your path to entrepreneurship. And hey, if you have an idea, be about that life, the startup life.